Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 393 of the FCPA Compliance Report. Today, I have back with me Dr. Pat Harned. Pat is the CEO of the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, and we visit today on the recently released ECI report on measuring the impact of ethics and compliance programs. This is part two of a four-part series on ECI's annual Global Business Ethics Survey. And in this report, we take a look at the wealth of information on the return of investments for the compliance professional around high-quality compliance programs. The report itself identifies 15 operational elements you can use for your program, as well as 17 validations to help self-assess your program. We consider the key findings of the report, what exactly is a high-quality compliance program, and the journey to achieving one. It is a fascinating exploration that gives you solid information that you can use going forward. We also link to the report. It's available for free. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and you are in for a real treat today because I have back with me Pat Harned, Dr. Pat Harned. She is the CEO of the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, and we're here today to talk about the second in a four-part series of reports under the Global Business Ethics Survey that ECI does each year. This one's entitled Measuring the Impact of Ethics and Compliance Programs. Pat, first of all, thank you for taking the time to visit with me today, and welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Tom. It's great to be able to chat with you again.
Pat, I cannot say enough good things about this report, so rather than me droning on, I'm just going to ask us to jump right into it, because this is really something that every compliance practitioner needs to read, utilize, and it has, just like I said, a wealth of information for the compliance professional going forward. So I was wondering if you might be able to tell us a little bit, some background on what is the ECI Global Business Ethics Survey, and how does this report measuring the impact of ethics and compliance programs fit into the overall structure?
Sure, I'm happy to. So the name, the Global Business Ethics Survey, actually now represents two long-standing research studies that we have done. Folks that are familiar with the work of our center know that since 1994, we have done a longitudinal study that was initially called the National Business Ethics Survey. And about every 2 years, we would survey employees, draw a sample of the workforce in the United States, and ask them about trends in their workplace from an ethics and compliance perspective. We would ask them about their culture, and we would also try to get some information to help us better understand what business leaders can do to improve conduct within their organizations. In 2016, we actually, at the request of a lot of our stakeholders, expanded that study and did the first ever global version of that same research study, and we started to collect data from employees in about 15 additional countries. Well, because we were then toggling between the National Business Ethics Survey and the Global Survey, we finally decided at the beginning of this year to just blend them under one name. It is now the Global Business Ethics Survey. It includes the U.S. Employee input, but also global input. So that is the overall name of the research study that we did. We also, for the first time this year, announced that instead of doing a study and putting out a report every 2 years, we're moving in the direction of collecting data at least once a year, but issuing 4 reports throughout the year, so that way we have an easier way to communicate what we're learning from the data. This study was really looking at whether we have since we started doing the study, we have looked at whether it makes a difference to an employee's perceptions and their conduct if there's an ethics and compliance program in their organization. But we've never really looked at the differences between programs and the differences on employee perceptions based on the quality of the program. So that was the purpose of this report.
So, Pat, what were the 5 or few key findings, I should say, from the report?
So one of the ways that we began to do this study, the reason we were finally able to look at quality was because for the first time we had a framework to work with. You have to have a definition in mind of what does a high quality program look like to be able to go out and then say, does it make a difference if a company has a higher quality program rather than what we would consider to be the minimum standard. So with this project, we worked with a definition that had been developed by a blue ribbon panel that we convened a couple of years ago that independently came up with principles and some business objectives that are indicative of a high quality program. And then we just asked employees about the extent to which they're aware of some of the practices that we would expect to be in place if a company has a higher quality program that they're working towards. So in the end, we looked at the difference between employees in organizations with a minimum standard program, the traditional compliance program. You've done what you need to do to comply with the law and relevant regulations versus an organization where an employee says that their leaders are committed to integrating ethics into the strategy of the organization. They're managing risks. They're building a culture of integrity. There's a speak up culture, and they're holding themselves accountable to certain standards and holding violators accountable. And what we ended up learning is that there is a remarkable difference between an organization with a higher quality program and an organization with a minimum standard program. The good news is that when it comes to ethics and compliance, something is better than nothing. Every step you take to develop a program makes a difference. You can show an impact, but quality really does make a difference in a very large way. So companies that have sort of implemented what they need to be able to comply with the law and are stopping there are really shortchanging themselves because organizations with higher quality programs just have a far greater impact.
So with you really tied the key findings to the high quality program. And as you said, that's something you've been working on for some time at the ECI. But I was wondering if you might be able to detail for us, what are the 5 principles of that program?
Sure. So when we created this blue ribbon panel, they wrestled for a long time with how do we actually try to define what a high quality program looks like. And the biggest thing about what they concluded was that a high quality program is not a check the box program. And so it's really in part a mindset, the way an organization actually thinks about, how, the meaning of ethics and compliance and how it actually fits into the way they do business. So in the end, the panel defined 5 principles of a program. The first is that ethics and compliance is central to business strategy, meaning that you can tell by the business objectives of the organization overall that ethics and doing business with integrity is a priority, that ethics is well resourced, the function is actually integrated and present in high-level decision making. The second principle is that risks are identified, owned, managed, and mitigated, but the important part of that is that that process for identifying and mitigating risks is owned by business leaders across the organization. It's not just one function's responsibility to do the enterprise risk assessment. Every business leader recognizes they have a role in constantly identifying, monitoring, mitigating risks. The third principle has to do with culture, that the organization is committed to building a culture of integrity. And again, that leaders across the organization own their own responsibility for culture. We know from our own research and other organizations' research that leadership is a huge driver of culture in an organization. So in a high quality program, leaders are actually tasked with and measured and held accountable for their role in sustaining a high quality culture, a strong culture of integrity. The fourth principle is that the organization encourages and it protects and it values the reporting of concerns. In other words, it's truly committed to creating a speak-up culture. So there are multiple avenues for employees to report. But more importantly, there's a mindset that a person who comes forward to report wrongdoing is actually helping the organization and not hurting the organization. They're not a snitch. They're actually rewarded and protected for having done so. And there's a concerted effort to try to address retaliation if it takes place. And then the last has to do with accountability, which is also a very big part of the extent to which an ethics program is taken seriously. And that is in two ways. There's accountability. First, that people who overstep the rules, people who violate the standards, no matter what level they are in the organization, are held accountable. And second, that the organization itself holds itself accountable when necessary. So it's owning its own mistakes. And in that sense, making disclosures as appropriate, or also holding itself accountable to its own employees and stakeholders.
Pat, you used a couple of words several times in there I'd like to maybe pick up a little bit. That typically, one word I do typically hear, but the second word perhaps not as much, and that's mindset. Mm-hmm. And you use that several times, that all of these, I think, 5 steps you've laid out, or 5 factors rather, or 5 principles of a high quality program, you use the word mindset. Why do you use that word?
In part because I think as an industry and as people who are supporting the ethics and compliance industry, we tend to think automatically about ethics and compliance as a job responsibility, a function, a set of very important procedures, internal controls. There's the enforcement process. There's lots of layers to how we talk about ethics and compliance. And most of the time when you ask an organization, do you have an ethics and compliance program, they'll point to those things. Absolutely. We have a chief ethics and compliance officer. We put money into these things. We do training. We have reporting lines. But the difference between that and a high quality program is the shared understanding across an organization that ethics and compliance is about far more than just that function, those sets of internal controls, those procedures. It's about a shared commitment and a shared ownership and a shared responsibility that every person in a position of leadership or management has the ability to either support or detract from the ethics and compliance effort. And it shows up then in conversations, it shows up in business objectives, it shows up in performance evaluations. And that, the best word we could think of for that, because it's amorphous, but is to say that it's a mindset. We are committing across the board that when we're thinking about what does it mean to be a successful business, it's being a successful business with integrity. And that other ending part is critically important.
So the other word that you use several times that now I think really makes is much more clear now is accountability. And you use that really for, it sounded like, from everyone from the boardroom to the shop floor is accountable for ethics and compliance in an organization. Is that correct?
Yes, and it's in a couple of different ways. They're accountable in the sense that if they are tasked with owning risk mitigation and building a strong culture and encouraging a speak-up culture, there's accountability if they don't do it. So in performance evaluations, part of the definition of a leader's success is that they're actually accepting responsibility and doing those things. They're upholding their end of the bargain from an ethics and compliance perspective. But the other part of accountability is when there are violations, when there is suspected wrongdoing, there's a process that happens every time without exception. Doesn't matter if it's a member of the board, the CEO, or somebody who's in sales or procurement or on the shop floor. There are no exceptions because the organization understands that once you start to waver on accountability, people stop believing that ethics and compliance really matters because there's a double standard. And that's where I do think what we found in this study, the payoff, if you're able to really commit to that, is substantial.
Well, why don't we just go right into that, because that was one of the things that struck me, which was the results. And the results are truly powerful. And you found several examples or instances where there was actually a more than a 10x increase in favorable ethical outcomes where there was a high quality program. I was wondering if you could just comment on that.
Sure. So we ended up, one thing that was a little bit different in this report, we often look at the impact of a program on the extent to which employees observe misconduct or report wrongdoing or feel pressure. This time we found there are so many elements, so many things that are positively impacted by a high quality program. We put them together into a definition we called positive, favorable ethics outcomes. And that includes things like people are more likely to report, they're more likely to say they're satisfied with their jobs, they're likely to stay and not transition to another organization. And so what we found was that in a high quality program, employees are 10 times more likely to say those kinds of favorable things than they are if they're working in an organization with a minimum standard program. And just to give you a couple of more specific examples, within that larger definition of favorable, good things happen if you have a high quality program, well, when employees are in a high quality program, they're more likely to report suspected wrongdoing. They're more likely to express satisfaction that they had a positive experience reporting wrongdoing. They're more likely to say that they work in a strong ethical culture, and to the point where 93% of employees in an organization with a high quality program who saw wrongdoing reported it to management. And 94% of them said that they were satisfied with the reporting process. Now, in organizations where there was no ethics and compliance program, only about a third of people reported. So you go from not many people reporting to almost everyone when there's suspected wrongdoing.
Pat, I was wondering if you might be able to detail for us some of the conclusions and perhaps even recommendations the report came up with.
Sure. So the first thing that we recommended especially, is that if an organization doesn't have any kind of ethics and compliance program in place, sorry, Tom, I need to clear my throat. If there is no ethics and compliance program, it's important to do something. And certainly there are lots of frameworks and guidelines available, but even looking to most notably and probably most commonly used is the U.S. sentencing guidelines. Chapter 8 defines the elements of an effective ethics and compliance program. Those are very simple things. I say simple. It can take some time to do, but implementing a code of conduct, doing training on that code, having a means to report for people who need to report anonymously or confidentially, those are important elements to begin to create even a minimum standard program, but also to make sure that the organization has identified a set of core values that they can lean on to help people understand how is it that we want to behave as a workplace? What does it look like for us to do business with integrity? But certainly, for organizations that already have an ethics and compliance program, the first part of it is to just make a decision about how important is it to us to work towards a higher quality program and to begin to try to get leadership buy-in for that. Again, there is the Blue Ribbon Panel report that we have available to the public on our website that helps to define that will give some guidance about what that looks like. But ultimately, for an organization that wants to begin to see this dramatic change in the outcome and the impact of their program, getting leaders to begin to commit to creating an environment where people can raise concerns, committing to the integrating ethics into the larger business strategy, having those 5 principles begin to drive the objectives and the priorities for the program will make a big difference. And I should also add, we worked with the framework that was done by our Blue Ribbon panel. Certainly, our definition doesn't have to be the be-all and end-all definition of a high-quality program, but I do think that the main principles that were suggested by the Blue Ribbon panel were very good ones, and so they certainly have a universal appeal.
Pat, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but you mentioned a couple of times that both this report, the Blue Ribbon panel report, and the first report this year are on the ECI website. Are those all available to the public?
They are. And also, I would just also add that after we released the Blue Ribbon panel report, we had a working group of practitioners that wanted to try to figure out, is it possible to map the maturity of an ethics and compliance program towards what we consider to be a high quality program. And that framework has been developed. We're actually formatting it now for public release. It's a very extensive and meaty document that will help an organization to essentially assess where it is right now and also have an idea of what it looks like as they go through the continuum of growth towards a high quality program. So certainly that too we will make available to the public. It'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks.
Well, Pat, this has been a really fascinating exploration, and I think something that every compliance practitioner is going to want to read and study for themselves. So thank you very much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. I have listed in the show notes several of the reports that Pat Harned mentioned throughout this podcast, as well as the subject matter of this podcast, the report measuring the impact of ethics and compliance programs. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thanks again for listening to this episode, and I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.